The wind blew far too cold for that time of year. It was not the common chill of autumn, which arrives slowly, announcing its presence. It was a biting cold, one that seeped into the coarse wool of their clothes and seemed to pass straight through the skin, reaching something deeper, something ancient. The wagon moved slowly along the dirt road, creaking under the weight of a family that no longer had anywhere to return to. Elias Harrow kept his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw tight, his lips murmuring prayers almost too quiet to be heard. Each word carried conviction and fear. He would never admit it aloud, but he felt it. He had felt it since the judgment. The community had rejected them. They called him proud, extremist, a heretic disguised as a God-fearing man. They said his interpretation of the scriptures was too severe, that his faith did not unite, it divided, and for that reason, they decided to expel him. The decision was proclaimed before everyone. Elias did not kneel. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply gathered his family and left, convinced that he was right, and that God would prove it. Behind him, seated in the wagon, was Margaret, his wife. Her hands were clasped so tightly her fingers had turned white. Her eyes remained lowered, avoiding the forest that grew around the road, as if it were advancing to swallow them. There was something wrong with those woods. She felt it. From the very first moment, trees too tall, twisted trunks, branches that seemed to lean toward the road. There were no birds singing, no sound beyond the creaking of the wagon and the wind whispering through the leaves, like voices that did not wish to be clearly heard. The children remained silent. Abigail, the eldest, walked beside the wagon. Her steps were steady, but her eyes betrayed unease. She was old enough to understand the weight of exile and the accusatory gaze of the community, which still seemed to burn against her back. Samuel and Ruth, the twins, whispered memorized prayers, repeating them as if they were a shield against something unseen. And in Margaret's arms, wrapped in simple cloth, slept the baby, the youngest, the most fragile, the promise of continuity. When the wagon finally stopped, the silence was absolute. The place Elias had chosen lay at the edge of the forest, where the land seemed fertile enough for planting and far enough from human corruption. At least, that was what he said. An irregular clearing opened before them, surrounded by trees so dense they blocked most of the sky's light. The sun always seemed distant there, as if that place did not fully belong to the world of men. Elias climbed down from the wagon and planted his feet firmly on the ground. He said, "Here we will build our life. Here we will serve God without interference." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. She watched the forest, and for a brief instant, she had the strange sensation that something was watching her back. The cabin was built with effort and silence. Days passed, marked by exhausting labor and restless nights. The wind never ceased completely. Even when everything seemed calm, there was always a distant whisper coming from the woods. The crops did not thrive as Elias had hoped. The land appeared good at first glance, but the seeds rotted before sprouting. When a plant did manage to emerge, it withered quickly, as if something drained its life force during the night. Margaret prayed more than ever. She prayed at dawn. She prayed before meals. She prayed before sleeping. But her prayers began to take on a desperate tone, almost pleading. Abigail noticed. She also noticed the looks her mother cast at her, too long, weighted with something that was not love. She was a suspect. The first night the baby cried without stopping. No one slept. The crying echoed through the cabin, loud, piercing, unlike any sound they had heard before. It did not sound like hunger or discomfort. It was distressed, as if something had frightened him deeply. Margaret rocked him, murmuring psalms, while Elias remained kneeling, asking for divine protection. Abigail watched from the shadows. When the baby finally calmed, the silence that followed was worse than the crying. It was heavy, dense. The next morning Margaret took the baby outside, trying to soothe him in the open air. Abigail went with her, helping hang clothes on the makeshift line. The wind blew gently. The forest remained motionless. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. She began to play with the baby, hiding her face and revealing it again, drawing soft giggles. Abigail watched, feeling a tightness in her chest, a mix of tenderness and fear. Margaret covered her face once more. When she uncovered it, The baby was gone. The smile vanished from her face instantly. The silence returned. "Abigail?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Where is he?" Abigail felt her heart race. "I don't know. He was here." Margaret began to scream. The sound echoed across the clearing, cutting through the forest like a desperate call. Elias ran out of the cabin. The twins followed, confused and terrified. They searched. They called. They scoured every corner of the clearing, every bush, every patch of earth. They screamed until their throats burned. Nothing. No sign of the baby. No crying. No footprints. The forest remained in absolute silence. Margaret fell to her knees, her face twisted in horror. Elias did not cry. He clenched his fists. "God is testing us," he said, his voice far too hard for someone who had just lost a child. But his eyes betrayed something else. Doubt, and something worse. Suspicion. The glances began to slowly turn toward Abigail. She felt it. She felt the invisible weight forming around her, like a tightening noose. That night, Abigail struggled to sleep. The wind blew harder, pounding against the cabin walls. Shadows danced in the weak candlelight, forming shapes that seemed to move on their own. That was when she heard it. A whisper. Low, close, calling her name. She opened her eyes. The forest was outside, and it seemed closer. The days following the baby's disappearance were not marked by ordinary mourning. There was no collective crying, no prolonged embraces, only silence. A thick, almost physical silence that accumulated inside the cabin like invisible smoke. Margaret began waking before dawn. She would sit at the table, staring at the empty space where the makeshift cradle had been. Sometimes she murmured the baby's name. Other times, she simply remained there, motionless, as if waiting for him to reappear on his own. Elias intensified his prayers. Now they were no longer pleas, they were sermons. Long speeches directed at God, but clearly meant for the family. He spoke of sin, of trial, of divine punishment, of how the Lord took away what one loved most to test the faithfulness of the righteous. Abigail listened in silence. Each word seemed to dig a little deeper inside her. The twins began to behave strangely. Samuel said he heard laughter coming from the forest at night. Low laughter, almost childlike. Ruth claimed she dreamed of a tall woman with long hair, standing among the trees, watching the cabin. Elias reprimanded them. "Lies of the enemy," he said. "Do not give voice to it." But fear had already taken root. The animals were the next to change. The goat Elias had bought with such effort before the exile became aggressive. Its eyes always seemed alert, too fixed. Sometimes Abigail had the sensation it followed her with its gaze, even when her back was turned. One morning, Margaret found the chickens dead. Their bodies were scattered across the floor of the small coop, necks twisted in impossible ways. There were no clear signs of a predator attack, no feathers strewn about. Just death. Margaret collapsed in tears. Elias slammed the coop shut, breathing heavily. "Witchcraft," he murmured. The word hung in the air. Abigail felt her stomach churn. She knew what that word meant. In the community from which they had been expelled, stories of witches were whispered at night. Women accused of straying from the faith, of seducing evil, of bringing ruin to crops and children. And now, that word had found a new home. Margaret began to watch Abigail closely. She noticed how her daughter seemed more distant, how she sometimes spent too much time near the forest, gathering firewood or fruit, how her gaze seemed too curious. "What do you do out there?" Margaret asked one night, her voice tense. "Work," Abigail replied, lowering her eyes. "Or listen to voices." The silence that followed was long. Elias did not intervene. That hurt more than the accusation. That night, Abigail dreamed. She was in the forest. The trees seemed taller than ever, their branches intertwined, forming a dark ceiling. The ground was covered in damp leaves and the air smelled of earth and blood. She heard crying. She followed the sound. At the center of a clearing there was a crouched figure, a woman, with her back turned. Her hair fell to the ground, black as night. "He is cold," the woman said, without turning her face. Abigail tried to speak, but no sound came out. The woman rose slowly. When she turned, her face was impossible to comprehend. There was no hatred, no compassion, only certainty. "You all belong to the forest," she said. Abigail woke up screaming. Margaret ran to her, gripping her shoulders. "What did you see?" she demanded. Abigail cried, trying to catch her breath. "Nothing. It was just a dream." But Margaret did not believe her. The next morning, the crop was completely ruined. The plants had rotted overnight, covered in a dark layer, as if something had drained all life from the soil. The stench was nauseating. Elias fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in despair. "We have been abandoned," he murmured. Margaret looked at Abigail, and for the first time she did not try to hide the hatred in her eyes. Or, "We were betrayed." The twins began repeating strange words during their play, phrases that made no sense, guttural sounds that seemed far too ancient for children so young. Abigail tried to make them stop. They laughed. "She taught us," Samuel said, pointing toward the forest. "The woman," Ruth added. Abigail's heart nearly stopped. "What woman?" They smiled. "The one who lives among the trees." Margaret heard and said nothing. That night, Elias gathered the family. The candle cast harsh shadows on the walls. "There is sin among us," he said, "and until it is purged, God will remain silent." His eyes settled on Abigail. "Confess," he ordered. Abigail felt her legs tremble. "I didn't do anything. The enemy speaks through denial," Margaret replied. The twins watched in silence, eyes wide. The wind struck the cabin violently, as if something had heard the conversation. In that instant, Abigail realized she was no longer part of that family. She was the sacrifice, and outside, the forest seemed to wait. After that night, something broke permanently inside the cabin. It was not a scream. It was not an argument. It was the absence of any trace of affection. Margaret stopped touching Abigail. She no longer handed her food directly. She placed the plate on the table, as if avoiding physical contact. Her eyes, once tired, now carried constant vigilance, almost hungry. Elias began to watch the forest, not to protect himself from it, but like someone awaiting confirmation. He walked to the edge of the trees at dawn, murmuring psalms in a trembling voice. Sometimes he stood there for long minutes, staring into the darkness between the trunks, as if waiting for an answer. One morning he returned pale. He did not say what he had seen. But that night he reinforced the cabin's locks. The twins no longer slept well. They woke speaking to themselves, sitting up in bed, eyes far too open for those still dreaming. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried. She said, "You don't belong to them." Ruth whispered to Abigail one afternoon while they gathered firewood. "Who said that?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer. Ruth pointed to the forest. "The woman. She said you are different." Samuel approached, wearing an unsettling smile. "She likes you." Abigail felt her stomach twist. "You must not listen to that," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a sin." The children laughed again. "Father listens too," Samuel said. Abigail froze. That night, she heard Elias leave the cabin. The creak of the door was soft, but enough to wake her. She rose silently and peeked through a crack in the wall. The moon was high. Elias walked toward the forest, clutching the Bible to his chest like a useless shield. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he already knew exactly where he was going. Abigail watched him disappear among the trees, and waited. The wind blew hard, carrying with it a strange smell. Iron, damp earth, something rotten. Time seemed to stretch, as if the night itself did not wish to move forward. When Elias returned, his face was covered in sweat. His eyes, however, were strangely calm. He said nothing. He simply knelt in the center of the cabin and prayed until dawn. Margaret watched everything in silence, but something in her had changed as well. She began to have visions. At times she swore she heard the babies crying coming from the forest. Other times she felt invisible hands pulling at her hair while she slept. She woke with red marks on her wrists, as if she had been held down. "She is punishing me," Margaret murmured one dawn, rocking herself in the corner of the cabin. Abigail tried to comfort her. Margaret shoved her away. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "You brought this upon us." The conflict was no longer concealed. It was declared. The next morning, Ruth disappeared for several hours. Margaret panicked. Elias ran through the clearing, calling his daughter's name. Samuel cried, clinging to his father's leg. Abigail went to the forest. She didn't know why. She only felt that she had to go. The air grew thicker among the trees. Light barely pierced the tangled branches. Each step made Abigail's heart beat faster. Then she heard it. Ruth was sitting on a fallen log, far too calm for someone who had been lost. Beside her were strange markings on the ground, circles drawn with something dark. "Ruth?" Abigail whispered. "What are you doing here?" The girl smiled. "She showed me things." "Who?" Ruth pointed behind her. Abigail felt the presence before she saw it. Something was there, not fully visible, not completely hidden, a silhouette among the trees, too tall, too still to be human. "Go back home," Abigail said, her voice breaking. Ruth obeyed without resistance. When Abigail turned again, the presence had vanished. But she felt it. She felt that she had been watched. That night, Elias made a decision. "Tomorrow we will purify this house," he said solemnly. "Evil feeds on doubt and on disobedience." Margaret nodded. The twins watched in silence. Abigail understood. Purification required a culprit, and she had already been chosen. The purification began before sunrise. Elias woke the family in silence, lighting only a single candle. The flame trembled as if reacting to the tension in the air. Margaret was already standing, her eyes hollow, her face marked by sleepless nights. Abigail felt fear turn into something heavier. She realized that this would not be just another prayer. "Kneel," Elias ordered. Everyone obeyed. Abigail hesitated for a second, then knelt as well. The ground was cold, damp. The sensation crept up her knees like a warning. Elias began reading the Bible aloud, choosing passages about sin, punishment, and obedience. Each word seemed loaded with judgment, thrown like an invisible blade at Abigail. Margaret watched her daughter without blinking. "There is something among us that has drawn this punishment," Elias said. "Something that opened the door." The wind struck the cabin hard, nearly extinguishing the candle. Abigail felt a shiver run down her spine. "Confess," Elias repeated. "I have nothing to confess," she replied, her voice weak but steady. Margaret rose suddenly. "Lie!" she screamed. "Since you grew older, since your eyes began to wander toward the forest, everything fell apart." Abigail tried to respond, but Elias raised his hand, demanding silence. "God will speak through discipline," he declared. He ordered the twins to go to the other room. Samuel began to cry, begging to stay. Ruth only watched Abigail, her face far too serious for her age. When they were alone, Elias tied Abigail's wrists with a thick rope. "This is for your own good," he said, without emotion. Margaret turned her face away. Abigail felt the knot tighten, not only around her wrists, but inside her chest. She was left tied in the corner of the cabin. Hours passed. The sun rose slowly, but the light seemed unable to reach that place. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe. Abigail tried to pray, but the words would not come. Instead, strange thoughts emerged. She began to remember moments when she had truly felt alive, walking alone, feeling the wind on her face, watching the forest without fear. She felt ashamed of it. And then, something different. A feeling of being welcomed. "You did nothing wrong." The voice came soft, almost gentle. Abigail lifted her head. There was no one there. "They are blind," the voice continued, "trapped in a faith that consumes them." Abigail's heart raced. "Who's there?" she whispered. The wind slipped through a crack in the cabin, extinguishing the candle. In the darkness she felt something draw closer. It did not touch her, but it was far too close. "You feel it," the voice said. "You always have. That's why they are afraid of you." Abigail squeezed her eyes shut. "Go away." A low laugh echoed. "I was never gone." Outside, Margaret began to scream. Elias ran to her. One of the goats lay on the ground, convulsing. Its eyes rolled back, foam spilling from its mouth. A guttural sound escaped its throat, impossible for an ordinary animal to produce. Elias fell to his knees. "Lord, forgive us." Margaret looked toward the cabin. "It's," she whispered. "It's still not enough." They went back. Elias threw the door open violently. Abigail lifted her face. Her eyes were different. Not empty. Awakened. "Untie me," she said. "See how she speaks," Margaret screamed. The wind blew hard again. The cabin walls groaned. Elias hesitated. For a brief instant, fear pierced his faith. Then something fell from the ceiling, a bundle of dry straw, stained with something dark. Margaret screamed. She marked the house. Panic spread like fire. Elias dragged Abigail outside. "If the evil came through you, it will be outside these walls that it will be confronted." They walked toward the forest. The twins cried, following behind, begging to go back. Abigail felt the ground beneath her bare feet, cold and uneven. The forest seemed to open its path, branches parting, as if awaiting that moment. "Stop," she whispered. "You don't know what you're doing." "We know exactly," Elias replied. "We are saving our souls." The presence manifested again. This time, not only as a... The trees seemed to lean inward. The wind whispered words that did not belong to the language of men. And Abigail realized with terrifying clarity that this was not a divine judgment. It was an invitation. The forest swallowed the last trace of the clearing. Perfeito. Sigo com a tradução fiel, sem qualquer alteração de conteúdo. As they advanced, daylight seemed to dissolve among the branches, as if the sun were not permitted to follow them. The air grew colder, heavier. Each breath carried a metallic taste in the mouth. Abigail stumbled but did not fall. Something held her. She felt it. They were not hands. It was as if the ground itself refused to let her collapse. Elias stopped. "Enough," he said, his voice trembling, yet firm in its attempt at authority. "Here." Margaret looked around with wide eyes, her lips murmuring senseless prayers. Samuel cried softly. Ruth remained strangely calm, watching the trees as if recognizing a familiar place. "Kneel," Elias ordered Abigail. She did not obey. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped. The birds, if they had ever existed there, did not sing. "I said kneel," Elias shouted. Abigail lifted her face. Her fear was still there, but something new rested above it, clarity. "You brought me here to die," she said, "and you call that faith?" Margaret stepped forward. "You killed your brother," she spat. "You drew the evil to us." The pain of those words pierced Abigail's chest, but the presence answered before she could. The trees began to creak, not like wood in the wind. Like bones, a figure slowly emerged between the trunks. Tall, thin, impossible to define precisely. Its body seemed to merge with the darkness, as if it were not made of the same substance as humans. Its eyes, however, were clear, attentive, ancient. Margaret screamed. Samuel fell to his knees, covering his face. Elias tried to raise the Bible, but his hands trembled so violently that the book fell to the ground, opening on some random page. The figure spoke. Its voice did not echo in the air. It appeared inside the mind of each of them. "You called me." Elias shook his head in desperation. "No, I serve the Lord." "You served fear," the entity replied, "and fear always opens doors." Margaret began to laugh, a broken laugh. "Take her," she begged. "Take the girl and leave us in peace." The entity tilted its head slightly. "You have already given me everything you had." Abigail felt the ground vibrate beneath her feet. The entity turned toward her. "You listened when no one else listened," it said. "You saw when all others closed their eyes." Abigail swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" The figure moved closer. The air turned icy. "That you choose." Elias screamed and lunged forward, gripping a sharpened branch in his hands. "Stay away from her!" He never reached her. The ground gave way beneath his feet, not a deep pit, just enough for him to stumble, falling sideways with a dry crack. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the forest. Margaret ran to him. "Elias!" He struggled to breathe, blood spilling from his mouth. His eyes filled with true panic, not the fear of God, but the fear of the end. The entity did not look at him. Your faith demanded sacrifices, it said. Now reap the harvest. A branch fell from above, heavy as a sentence. The impact was final. Margaret screamed until her voice was gone. Samuel tried to run. The trees closed in. Ruth watched everything in silence. Then she walked toward Abigail. She said this would happen, she murmured. Abigail knelt in front of her younger brother. Close your eyes. He obeyed. The wind rose again. When it stopped, Samuel was no longer breathing. Margaret collapsed beside the bodies, rocking back and forth, murmuring senseless words. Her eyes were empty. The entity approached her. You gave your children to fear, it said. Now stay with it. Margaret screamed one last time, and then she fell silent. The forest returned to stillness. Abigail remained standing, alone. The entity turned toward her. Come, it said. There are others like you. Abigail looked at the bodies. She felt pain, but not guilt. Pain no longer bound her. What will I be? She asked. The figure extended something that resembled a hand. Free. Abigail took a step forward. The forest did not react when Abigail took the final step. There was no thunder. There were no screams. There was no supernatural light. Only silence. A deep, ancient silence. One that seemed to exist even before the world learned how to breathe. She walked among the trees, guided not by words, but by a certainty that had settled in her chest. The entity no longer needed to speak. Its presence was now like the air itself, invisible, inevitable. The ground beneath her feet was soft, covered with leaves and roots that did not wound her. The forest did not reject her. For the first time since the exile, Abigail felt no fear. Behind her, what remained of her family slowly vanished into the shadows. Not because the forest consumed them, but because there was nothing left to save. They had been devoured long before, by guilt, by distorted faith, by the desperate need to find someone to blame for their own failure. A clearing appeared ahead. It was different from the one near the cabin. Older. The air there felt heavier, as if it carried echoes of voices that no longer had bodies. There were other figures. Women, some young, others so old, their faces seemed carved by the night itself. None of them smiled. None seemed hostile. They simply watched. Abigail stopped at the center of the clearing. She felt the wind move over her body, lifting her hair, touching her skin like curious hands, yet respectful. There was no shame there, no judgment. The entity emerged once more. Now its form seemed less undefined, still impossible to fully comprehend, but less threatening, not because it had changed, but because Abigail had. You have crossed, the voice said, not through hatred, not through desire, but through survival. Abigail took a deep breath. They gave me up, she said, in the name of something they called God. Gods born of fear always demand sacrifices, the entity replied, and they are never satisfied. The women in the clearing began to move. They formed a slow, silent circle. Their feet touched the ground with reverence, as if each step were an ancient pact being renewed. Abigail felt something detach from within her. It was not pain. It was weight. The weight of guilt that had never been hers. The weight of blind obedience. The weight of existing only to serve. She closed her eyes. She saw images. Other girls. Other women. Expelled. Accused. Delivered to the forest. To fire. To the blade. Always in the name of faith. Of purity. Of order. All of them had arrived there broken. Not all had survived. But those who did, learned. What happens now? Abigail asked. The entity moved closer. Now you listen, it said. And when you listen, you decide. Abigail opened her eyes. The women watched her with something that was neither approval nor expectation. Recognition. She felt the world beyond the forest. She felt other isolated houses, other families consumed by fear, other children growing under the weight of guilt before even understanding what it meant to live. The forest did not move. It waited. Abigail inhaled deeply. I stay, she said, not as a vow, as a realization The entity stepped back. "Then you will walk between two worlds," it replied, never fully belonging to either, but free of both. The women slowly dispersed, disappearing among the trees like shadows returning to where they had never truly been meant to leave. Abigail remained in the clearing until dawn. When the first light of day slipped through the branches, the forest seemed ordinary to any other eye. Silent, still, but alive. Days later, the cabin was found empty. No bodies were recovered. The crops never grew again in that soil. Travelers passing through the region avoided the place. They spoke of a tightening in the chest when approaching the forest. Some swore they heard footsteps following them among the trees. Others claimed to hear a female voice, gentle, asking them to turn back. And many obeyed, because fear still lives there, but not alone. Sometimes, when the moon is high and the wind blows in just the right direction, it is possible to see a silhouette among the trees. It does not threaten, it does not call, it only watches, and the silence remains.